Vices.
My definition is very simple and objective.
Yeah, what is
Anyone who will enforce any idea or prejudice by physical force, anyone who initiates the use of force against another human being, in that instant is acting like a dictator.
Yeah.
And if he establishes that as a political system, then that's a dictatorship. But I'm the arch enemy of physical force.
Right.
As most of you probably know, I'm a former anarcho-capitalist and libertarian. However, I still keep an ear tilted towards some of the more quality players in this scene, particularly Tom Woods, Dave Smith, Radical Liberation, and the sphere around the Mises Institute. For my part, I still think well of this sort. They pass the friend-enemy test, and I see them as allies on many issues. There's lots of utilitarian arguments for libertarianism, and on an individual policy-by-policy basis, I would agree with many of these myself. However, fundamentally, libertarianism rests on a moral claim called the Non-Agression principle, which can be summed up as don't hurt people or take their stuff. In this video, I will be critiquing the non-aggression principle and will say up front that any secular ethical claims I will simply disregard. They will not be addressed here because atheists or agnostics are in no position to give any account for their moral claims or have them respected based on their materialist presuppositions. However, the libertarians I cited at the beginning are either all religious, at least believe in God, or are associated with the Mises Institute, chaired by Tradcath Lew Rockwell. The moral argument of the non-aggression principle, coming from a Christian or religious perspective, needs to be taken more seriously, to be critiqued. It is from this presupposition of the existence of the Christian God that I will now begin my critique of the NAP. But before we begin, if you'd like to support my work here on YouTube, please consider becoming a background subscribe star for as little as $2 a month, which includes access to exclusive content. You may also send a PayPal with a message if you'd like. Links are in the description. Thanks, and let's get back into it. Now, the term aggression can have a lot of connotations, but the way libertarians typically formulate this is the initiation of the use of force, meaning violence or threat of violence. This would seem in line with the biblical commandments, thou shalt not murder and thou shalt not steal. These seem like sensible things necessary for any kind of society to follow. Why should not this then apply to the state and authorities for the sake of consistency? And since all rulers and polities throughout history have relied on violence, are they not all illegitimate? Setting aside the issue of whether dictatorial prophets, kings, or judges and their lieutenants classify as a state or not, the scriptures of both Jewish and Christian tradition are clearly full of multiple examples where God's chosen hurt people and took their stuff. Not only that, they initiated NAP violations, so to speak. When the Hebrews came to Canaan, the Canaanites hadn't done anything to them, yet, nonetheless, with the Lord's blessing, they killed the people of the land or drove them off, even though they'd mixed their labor with it and had Rothbardian homesteading rights to the soil, one might say. What are we to make of this? Put rather glibly, sometimes it's okay to hurt people and take their stuff, even if they've never done anything to you directly. The Canaanites' very existence was, apparently, an offense to God, and he used the Israelites to clean them from the land and gift it to his chosen people in an aggressive war. Acts of violence don't always fit simply into the libertarian NAP box, if we're to look at this from a biblical perspective. Now, as some ideal, sure, no aggression or violence would be nice, but that would require human nature to be other than it is, and frankly, for the fall to have never happened. It's wishful thinking as a Christian, particularly because God's people themselves aggress without moral condemnation on many occasions. A skeptic will hear this and say, oh, a contradiction in scriptures, Christians BTFO'd. Apart from the fact that not everything morally or spiritually is a dialectic, I'm going to again ignore these kinds of objections. Remember, this critique of the NAP presupposes the existence of the Christian God, which is also the God of the Old Testament, unless you're a Marcionite heretic. I'm also leaving it as a given for the Christian defender of the NAP and the critiquer of the NAP that they both believe in the divinely inspired nature of Scripture. How then, oh how, can we say that the Israelites could thus righteously violate the NAP? It's simple. The Canaanites deserved it. The Edomites deserved it. All of the people that the Israelites liquidated or dispossessed deserved it. They had become a stain on the land, and God chose to use the children of Abraham to wipe them from the earth and gift the land unto them, for the Israelites to hurt the Canaanites and to take their stuff. When the north kingdom of Israel fell into wickedness, God used the Assyrians to kill and chastise the Israelites. In so doing, many innocents were doubtless killed. Why did the Lord let innocents be killed by the ravening Assyrians? Because the Lord works in mysterious ways. To question why God lets bad things happen, or even makes them happen seemingly, is to be Job asking God why evils had befallen him and his family. Where wast thou when I laid the foundations of the earth? Declare if thou hast understanding, said God to Job. Now some ANCAPs may concede this, but still say, yeah, but God didn't approve of the state, meaning kings. And they'll quote 1 Samuel 8:16. The trouble with this is that the basis on which libertarians reject kingship or the state is that it violates the NAP. They may have some utilitarian argument about how the incentives of coercive power yield bad results for society, and that institutions with better incentives could be devised, but their main issue with coercive power is that it breaks the non-aggression principle, which I think they'd agree with. As we've already seen in one example from Scripture, the NAP is not some iron-hard thing that can never be violated ever. The basis on which God criticized the Hebrews for wanting a king wasn't because it was some rejection of the non-aggression principle. For the judges, before the time of Saul, were given the sword and the ability to righteously violate the non-aggression principle, as it were. God was displeased with the Israelites because they did not trust his providence, for him to provide a ruler in his own time. They wanted to be ruled directly by a human king and not be ruled by God because Samuel's sons didn't follow in their father's ways, as Scripture says. In a similar way, it was a lack of faith and obedience that also led Abraham to lie with Hagar when she had convinced him that there was no way she could conceive. The Israelites did not trust in the Lord to bring forth new judges, or dare I say it, even a king, in God's own good time. Make us a king to judge us like other nations, they said. The problem fundamentally was they wanted a ruler who would emulate the kings around them. They wanted God to speed up his timetable and bring them a ruler on their terms, in a misguided democratic impulse. Remaining in the Old Testament, let us look before the rise of King Saul in Israel. Prior to King Saul, the children of Israel were ruled first by patriarchs, such as Abraham, and prophets like Moses and Joshua, and judges. The structure of leadership in Israel from the bottom up looked something like this. You had fathers, village elders, elders among the tribes, and above those, judges who were called by God, especially in times of trouble. There may have even been local kings, but we'll get into that later. Also, cities were peopled at this time, and it is highly likely that there was some sort of lord or petty king in charge of these, if one wants to call them that, although there was indeed no king over all Israel. This, quote, stateless period, without a unifying king in the land, was also not exactly a golden age, for during this time there were many of the same issues and intrigues then that would later bedevil the people of Israel later, all of which is mentioned in the book of Judges. A red-pilled libertarian might see the period of the judges and say to himself, yes, based judges period in their Hoppian covenant communities. The trouble with that is they weren't exactly Hoppian covenant communities. They were a hodgepodge of blood-bound theocracies. You didn't sign a social contract and agree to live by them or otherwise be physically removed. The social contract, if you want to call it that, was signed for you through blood, circumcision, and you were killed for any number of infringements of the so-called social contract you were born into. But I didn't sign any contract. I didn't consent. Too bad. You're born an Israelite into a specific tribe. You didn't choose to be born into this community or join it. The community chose you to be born into it, and you have responsibilities to the community as a member, and the community has responsibilities to you, and you all have responsibilities to God. To submit to the Lord and the community, or die were the rules. And if you wanted to leave, you'd likely be killed by the enemy people outside of the Promised Land. And at the top of this very rigid social hierarchy were the sword-wielding Carlislean great men and religious zealots known as the judges. Also, as mentioned before, somebody had to be ruling the cities in the land of Israel as well. The high priest Eli, who raised Samuel, lived in the city of Shiloh. How was this city and other cities like it administered? I imagine by some manner of small-time hereditary lords, council of elders, theocratic clerics, or even local kings of some kind, who wielded coercive power there as territorial sovereigns in the name of justice and God's law. Does that sound like a mini-state to you? Is this libertarianism? Now, you can call this a stateless society if you want, but at that point, it largely seems to be semantic. Let's go back further before the book of Judges in Scripture to Genesis. Here the Lord reveals to Abraham that Sarah, his wife, will give birth to many nations and kings. Many nations and kings. The Lord himself has foreordained kingship to some of the descendants of Sarah. And it's pretty clear in the context of this passage that this is revealed as a positive thing. Alas, I shall sire blood-soaked monsters. Some of my descendants will be disgusting statist oppressors. The shame. Somehow, I don't believe that was the vibe Sarah was getting from God in this revelation. Part of the reason for God telling Abraham and Sarah this was to show how important they were in his plans, and how he could achieve great things with two people who desired to follow him and submit. If anything, being the mother and father of kings is an honor. There's also another issue with this idea that kingship is inherently immoral and not desired by God, according to the Christian anarcho-capitalist framework. And that comes from the book of Deuteronomy, which is a repetition of the law and certainly comes before the time of Samuel and King Saul. Quoting from Deuteronomy 17, verse 15 through 18. Thou shalt in any wise set him king over thee, whom the Lord thy God shall choose. One from among thy brethren shalt thou set king over thee. Thou mayest not set a stranger over thee, which is not thy brother. But he shall not multiply horses to himself, nor cause the people to return to Egypt, to the end that he should multiply horses. For as much as the Lord hath said unto you, ye shall henceforth return no more that way. Neither shall he multiply wives to himself, that his heart turn not away. Neither shall he greatly multiply to himself silver and gold. And it shall be, when he sitteth upon the throne of his kingdom, that he shall write him a copy of this law in a book out of that which is before the priests, the Levites. Now, stop me if I'm missing something here, but if monarchy, a type of statism, let's say, is morally indefensible, then why does God, even before the time of Samuel, give this advice on how to appoint a king, how he is legitimized, and how he should conduct himself? Also, whenever has a king not had the power of the sword, of coercive violence? When has any king ever not hurt people or taken their stuff? Did God accidentally give the Israelites immoral laws? I don't see how this isn't a checkmate to the Christian anarcho-capitalist position, or what mental gymnastics must be summoned to get around this. It would seem from this passage alone that, within the bounds of certain rules at least, kingship is literally biblical and ordained by God, explicitly. I haven't even mentioned anything from the New Testament, chock full of wisdom that all authority, including civil authority, is of God, to submit to it, to give unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, etc. Any one of these may perhaps be questioned or have some sort of meaning read into it, but taken in totality, especially with the Old Testament, I just don't see the basis for arguing against the plain language from a Christian perspective. There's also church tradition and the fathers' positions on kings going forward from the apostolic age. Needless to say, their consensus wasn't one of anarchism. This video isn't necessarily meant to be one big critique of the entire libertarian political philosophy and everything that it entails, but rather to criticize the moral basis. As I said at the beginning, it is a critique of the non-aggression principle within a Christian frame, both for and against. And hopefully, it's given you something to ponder about. This has been Mr. Patriarch. I hope I've provided some food for thought. Let me know what you think in the comments. Again, if you'd like to support me, please consider becoming a backer on Subscribestar for as little as $2 a month. Special thanks to my backers, Burnham's Ghost, Count Elmsley, Symbols, Focron, JNS77, Fresno Pharmacist, The Prudentialist, Skeptical Waves, Nevermore Night, Winter Phoenix, Forest Kieran, Holophonist, GC Mitt, Hominid Ape, and Ven. I appreciate all you guys. Thanks to everyone for tuning in, and I'll see you next time. Patriarch out.